So I have the pleasure today of speaking with the esteemed Amber Karnes, who is the founder of Body Positive Yoga. And I reached out to Amber because an issue came up in a yoga for arthritis training. I wasn't the facilitator, but in our trainings, we're talking about yoga as applied to arthritis in its many forms, right? There are over 100 different kinds of arthritis. They all have different risk factors and different pathophysiology and different treatment strategies. And the most common of those is osteoarthritis, in particular osteoarthritis in the weight-bearing joints of the knees and hips and low back. And one of the risk factors for osteoarthritis's initial onset, as well as its progression, is body weight. And therefore, one of the recommendations for prevention and management of osteoarthritis is the reduction of body weight. And this can be a sensitive topic for people who have larger bodies and have osteoarthritis, people who have larger bodies and may have struggled with their relationship to their body or the size of their body for perhaps a lifetime. And that discussion, I think, is important to have not only in the context of the physiology of arthritis and biologically what's happening in, for example, the knee joint with loading of weight on that joint and friction, etc., but also to consider the real world social implications of making a recommendation around body weight or suggesting that body weight is a risk factor for a disease or its progression. And so I wanted to bring Amber in order to have a discussion around this from a body positive perspective, so that we can think about how to talk about arthritis risk factors, treatment strategies, prevention strategies from a body positive perspective. So with that long introduction to the topic, Amber, thank you so much for being here.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm glad to be able to have this conversation.
Yeah, so can we just start by talking about body positivity in general? For those who are unfamiliar with that concept, what even is that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that, body positivity is something that's moved, I think, more into mainstream awareness in the past few years, for sure. So there's sort of a body positive movement that many people maybe have seen online. That's sort of like, there's people on Instagram who are, influencers who post about that and talk about body image and things like that. But the body positive movement really started out of the fat acceptance movement in the 60s and 70s, where we had a group of folks, mostly a lot of like queer, disabled, people of color, who all are fat folks. And I'll just pause for 1 second to say that when I talk about folks in larger bodies, sometimes I say it that way and sometimes I say fat. Fat's a word that I use to identify with and talk about my own body, and many folks in larger bodies do. Many also don't. So, but if I say fat folks or fat bodies, I want you to hear in this conversation a neutral descriptor, right? I personally think that body diversity is normal. And so when I use fat to describe bodies or myself or whatever, I want you to hear it as if I would say, I'm short, I'm fat, I have green hair, I have tattoos, I wear glasses, all those things, right? So
Amber, before you go on with the history, just because you did this little sidebar, I want to follow up on that by asking, for those of us who are not in large bodies, is there a sensitive way to, what kind of terminology is most neutral and most appropriate for people who don't own those labels?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think, when I have conversations with folks and sort of like have that whole sidebar and whatever, I feel like at that point, you know, if we've made the determination and the qualification that the word fat in this discussion is about body size, and it's not a judgment on whether that body size is good or bad or right or wrong, or that person is lazy or not lazy, or, you know, all the things that can be
all the
sort of couched
connotations
around that word. Yeah, like society definitely has some ideas about fat and fat folks and that kind of stuff. You know, I think in that purpose of a conversation, I basically think like we can use that word interchangeably because we're both agreeing like what it means and how we're going to use it. But for folks that maybe like you don't know the room, or you want to make sure that you don't, you know, offend anyone, well, you're going to offend someone. But I would just say like people in larger bodies, people with larger bodies, folks at higher weights, you know, we can describe it in such a way like that doesn't make a determination or a diagnosis where a word like obesity or overweight basically like pathologizes a body size, when we know that, well, maybe we don't know that, but we'll get into that. But like, which is the basis of whether, you know, these categories of like normal weight or overweight exist is a pretty arbitrary and scientifically not sound tool. So you know, even just addressing like that is sort of a radical position, I think, especially when, you know, every research article that I start to read that has anything to do with folks in larger bodies starts out like, you know, the obesity epidemic is well known and it is very concerning. Like that's how every study starts out.
Sure.
Anyhow, but that's a good question. I want to just circle back to the original one you asked.
Yeah, please.
So body positivity was born out of the fat acceptance movement, which was a movement created by and for marginalized folks who are experiencing systemic discrimination because of their body size. And so when the fat acceptance movement started, it was a really radical, like underground thing to try to, you know, not only get individual folks to like look at their own bias around like, you know, which bodies do we value and which ones do we not? And how do we make sure that, you know, dominant culture doesn't dictate like that these, you know, arbitrarily held beauty standards or whatever, or health standards or productivity standards, right? There's lots of ways we can look at that. Don't dictate like how we create laws and create policies and create, you know, we ensure that all human beings have equal rights and treatment and access. And so, so the body positivity movement sort of was born out of that. And I think originally was to maybe address some of the stuff that, some identities that intersect with fatness, but that maybe weren't specifically called out, where a lot of these, you know, activists were fat and disabled or fat and queer or fat and person of color. But body positivity sort of like took it out of the just fat acceptance movement, where it's like all about body size specifically, and is like more like nobody's left behind. You know, body positivity is not just about size, it's about recognizing that as human beings, our value is not tied to the way that our body looks or the way that our body functions or the color of our skin. It's tied to the fact that we are human beings who have inherent value and worth that aren't tied to any of those things, even though, you know, dominant culture is set up in a way that 100% associates worth with productivity or worth with beauty or worth with ability or worth with age. So yeah, body positivity is really about honoring the inherent value that we all have as human beings and recognizing the humanity in one another, especially in a way that challenges like that unconscious bias that a lot of us hold, right? Where when we see someone who's very fundamentally different in appearance from us, sometimes we get that like, oh, you know, feeling. And so like, that feeling is learned. And so body positivity and the fat acceptance movement, especially, and disability rights movement and others, like, are about challenging that thing when it comes up, and recognizing that as individuals, we can shift and change the assumptions that we hold about different types of bodies, about people that look different than us, about people who live differently than us. And recognizing that, you know, discrimination isn't just like individual people having mean thoughts about other people, it's systemic. And so we really have to look at the way that, those individual people with their unconscious biases who are functioning under like this dominant culture that also like confirms and then enforces those biases with laws, right? So it's, for example, it's completely legal to discriminate on the basis of weight in 49 states. And we know from that, it's been well studied that fat folks face higher rates of discrimination at work, right? In hiring practices, in pay gap, in healthcare, there's huge bias in the medical field, which, can result in life and death outcomes for folks. Fat folks are less likely to get a fair trial. Like all of these things have been well studied and documented. And so, so the fat acceptance movement isn't just about like, oh, let's make sure fat people don't have their feelings hurt because other people think they're gross or like whatever. It's not about that. It's about, it's a political movement that's really about making sure that the systemic, barriers that are put into place that don't set us all up, to have equal access and equal success, making sure that those get addressed both on the, the legislative level, but also at the root, which is, in each and every one of us, making sure that we learn what our biases are and that we learn to challenge them when we need to. So long answer, but I think it's probably an important setup.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, there are probably plenty of people who are familiar with some of these issues for people of color or for the LGBT community that may not have thought about how these issues also apply to people with various body sizes.
Yeah, for sure.
And then, of course, there's the intersectionality when, you're experiencing that discrimination and bias on multiple fronts.
Definitely. And, as identities intersect, right? Like, so if you have someone who is, both fat and disabled, discrimination and stigma tends to increase. And so I think it's important when we start looking at this, especially, the conversation we're having, which is around arthritis, which, many people who experience disability or are disabled, that's a factor.
And so the leading cause of disability.
Right.
Yeah.
And, with this quote unquote obesity epidemic, you can't see me, but I put scare quotes around that every time I say it. And we can get into that more if we want to. But, I think if we have like the leading cause of disability in the U.S., I don't know if that's the U.S. or the world, but also with, the majority of Americans now landing in the category of overweight or obese, although that could change because they do change the BMI chart when they feel like it.
So can we go there, Amber?
Yeah.
Okay, so so full disclosure, I am a researcher, and I'm also I'm also a yoga therapist, and I'm also a choreographer, and so I have done a lot of work in the arts, which of course there are lots of marginalized folks in the arts and lots of people who think about marginalization and what to do about it in that community. So I have sort of, put various hats on at times in my life, and the scientist in me is trained to look at data analytically. And yet I also understand that data doesn't exist in a vacuum and that there's context for it. And especially my PhD is in public health. And so public health looks at phenomenon on a broader scale. So not necessarily just the physiology that's happening for one particular person, but the societal implications and issues and what policy does to affect that and those sorts of things. So just to admit the lens that I'm looking at this issue through, I've done a lot of research looking at the effects of yoga for people living with arthritis. And in that research, we have recruited people living with arthritis. We've done this at various institutions and in various communities around the country, and provided a yoga intervention, not modern postural yoga, just asana based, but a comprehensive yoga program that includes pranayama and meditation, mindfulness, relaxation, philosophy, and looked at what are the effects of those practices for people who are living with arthritis in its various forms. And I want to reiterate that while our research looks at many different types of arthritis, they are not the same, and they all have different risk factors and different symptoms and different experiences. And this conversation, I want to focus on osteoarthritis, which is the most prevalent and also the most associated with body weight. So you had said, you had talked about the obesity epidemic in air quotes, and I know that you're not suggesting that Americans aren't getting larger, because that is data. What you're suggesting is that it's not an epidemic. And so what I want to let me ask you the question, and then I'll give you free reign. So there is an association scientifically between body size and a variety of health conditions, including osteoarthritis. So can you talk about the air quotes part of it?
Yes, for sure. So we do know that the evidence seems to show that some people classify it as like overweight or obese, which is according to the BMI chart. We're going to get in that in 1 second.
Okay.
Have an elevated risk for some diseases, right? Including like arthritis, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, diabetes, right? All the diseases that, quote unquote, everyone knows are caused by obesity.
Sorry, I'm going to put a point on this, that obesity is associated.
Oh yeah, and I want to get into that. But what I'm suggesting is that the way that media, translates studies into headlines.
That's fair.
And the way that dominant culture views obesity and these particular diseases that we're talking about is that most people, when they hear, that higher body weights are correlated with higher rates of cancer. What people hear who don't understand research or have never maybe read research is that obesity causes cancer.
Right. Okay.
Right?
Yes.
And so I think dominant culture for sure has a narrative, and research and science for sure, even though a lot of the research contradicts itself or points to, other things, is that this causes that. And it's not that simple. We actually don't know the this causes that equation. And so I think
so Amber, I just want to pause for a teachable moment here, because not all of our audience understands research to say that correlation and causality are not the same, right? So
that's where I'm going.
What correlation means is that if you have this factor, then there is a higher likelihood that you'll have that factor. And an example that I use with my students that's really concrete to drive this home is that there's a correlation between ice cream consumption and deaths by drowning. And that doesn't mean that if you eat ice cream, you will drown. What it means is that when there is a lot of ice cream consumption, there is also a lot of drowning, and that's because in the summer, both of those things rise. And so if you were to look at a chart, you would see that every year in the summer, both ice cream consumption and deaths by drowning go up, and then every winter they go down, and it could look as though one is causing the other, but really they're just tracking together for a third reason that has nothing to do with their relationship.
Right, which in this case is heat, right? So so that, I'm glad you made that point. That's exactly where I was going to go. The example that I use is ice cream consumption and murder, which murder rates, which also go up in the summer, and it's still heat, right? Because so, but I think that it's important to just say that, because when we read research and we see that chart, it looks very compelling. I think it's important to look at how was this study designed? Who paid for it?
Sure.
How, do the researchers, we have to consider the bias of the researchers doing the research, even with the the tiny bit of yoga research that's been done, which I'm in a program right now that I'm having to read a lot of it. Even in the yoga research, the people that we're selecting for surveys are people who are in smaller bodies. And that's often a limiter on research projects, because there's been projects I wanted to participate in before, but they put a cap on the BMI. So a lot of times, even the research we get where we're showing, well, this did this, we just don't, by and large, have a ton of, we don't have these clear connections that I think a lot of people think are there. So, are there associations between being at higher weights and certain risk factors for diseases? Yeah, we've got correlations there. We don't know that the higher weight is causing the thing, right?
Would you say that that's true in arthritis, that we can't say mechanistically that when there is more weight on a joint, there is more friction and therefore more degradation of the connective tissue?
I think that that's possible, but I think that, thin people get arthritis too. And
absolutely. Yes.
And that, when we're talking about mechanistically, with biomechanics, we can look at, and I'm not exactly sure how the studies were designed that, I listened to a recording where I heard someone, I think one of your instructors, saying something about like, with a 1 pound, body weight loss, it results in, biomechanically 10 pounds less on the resting joint and 70 pounds less on an active joint. Like what we're talking about are living, breathing, human organisms that have tensegrity and that have the capacity for change. So when we're talking about load, right, like whether a knee joint can stand the load that it's bearing, whether that's a person who's 120 pounds or 220 pounds or 420 pounds, the question is not, can that bone or can that tissue survive the weight load? Mm-hmm. It's about, can the body as a system, including not just the bones and the cartilage, but also the muscles and the connective tissue and everything else that's part, and how the person moves, and can they move well, and what's their alignment like, and all of that stuff. Right. And, that stuff, I think, is something that we have to look at. It's not just a simple math equation.
So
we know that people at different body weights have different outcomes based on their activity level or their diet or all those different things, which are different from body weight. And I think that in this discussion, it's important to remember that weight is one data point, it's one factor, but there are many, many other factors as well.
Right. So there are lots of other risk factors for arthritis. And one of them is repetitive motion. So regardless of body size, if you're doing the same motion over and over again for years, you're going to wear at the joint in the same fashion. And over time, that can have an effect. Prior injury. So especially people who play sports young and without a break, and don't cross train and all of that. And, if you have a torn ligament in your knee when you're young, you could be at greater risk for arthritis when you're older. Genetics plays a role, and for a variety of reasons, hormonal, the structures that we have, we partly inherit in terms of the angles of our joints, etc. And age, of course, is a risk factor. The older you get, the longer you've had this body, the less resilient your tissues may be, and we can have some effect on that with our lifestyle. But age is a risk factor for arthritis, perhaps osteoarthritis in particular, perhaps more than any other. And so I think that that's important to point out, that this is just one of many factors.
Sure. Yeah.
And
I think, go ahead. No, I just want to, since we're talking about, changing body weight, I think it's important to talk about BMI and the standards that are literally used for every single medical intervention and research-based whatever. Sure. So BMI stands for body mass index, and for those of you listening who might not know exactly what that is, it's basically an equation. It's your weight in kilograms divided by your height in meters squared. So this is it's a math equation, and that math equation might sound weird, and I agree with you. This was created by this man named Adolf Quetelet. I might be pronouncing his name wrong, but in the 1800s, and he was really fascinated with like regularity in statistical patterns, and so he created data on rates of crime with an interest in what he called moral anatomy, and that's like the phrase that he would use. Which included things like marriage or mental illness and mortality, including suicide. So he believed that conclusions come from data of large numbers, like populations, rather than from a study of individuals. And you mentioned this when you were talking about your background, right? That like public health doesn't look at individuals, it looks at large amounts of data. So what Quetelet was trying to do with the BMI was to figure out like who is the average man. And he basically was like, okay, if we can figure out the average man and he's like the perfection of like the physique and whatever, and we can like decide like this is the, you know, he was looking at moral anatomy, remember? So he wanted to find out like, okay, with these rates of crime, can we study these different types of people and find like who's the perfect one who gets married and has a family and doesn't commit crimes and doesn't commit suicide. Like those are kind of the things that he looked at. And everyone else who differs from that proportion or condition determines deformity or disease or monstrosity. That was actually a word that he used in the research that he did. Right, so he gathered information on the height and weight of different populations. He really didn't have an interest in studying overweight or obese individuals. He even explicitly said that it couldn't and shouldn't be used to indicate the level of fatness or the level of health in an individual. And so it's basically this equation, scientifically speaking, is nonsense because there's no like physiological reason to square a person's height.
Well,
right? He had to square the height to get a formula that matched the data. So if you can't fix the data, you rig the formula. But it doesn't make allowance for the proportions of bone and muscle and fat in the body.
Right.
It doesn't.
Can you stop there for a moment to drive home that point? So what BMI does not tell us anything about what the body is made of, what the various tissue proportions are. It tells us the relationship of height to weight. So how large is the body? How much mass does the body carry proportional to its height? And so an example that I've used is that Shaquille O'Neal is obese. That's a dated reference at this point. But if you're carrying a lot of muscle tissue, then your BMI is as high as if you're carrying a lot of fat tissue. And those tissues are metabolically different, physiologically different, structurally different. And BMI doesn't account for that. BMI sort of assumes that the relationship will be that there is sort of a standard in terms of as body weight climbs, so does fat mass by this amount.
Right. And so, so a lot of professional athletes are obese by the BMI chart. I think a professional athlete who's obese has a very different experience than, someone who you would look at and say, like, that's an obese person walking into a medical office or getting, a treatment plan suggested from a provider. And so, like, that stuff we can, talk about more, but we can set that aside. And just to round out the convo about BMI, like, BMI suggests that there are, like, distinct categories of underweight, ideal, overweight, and obese, right? But these categories have like sharp boundaries that rest on like a decimal place, basically. Right. So BMI is like really terrible at understanding like an individual's health or an individual's risk profile or anything other than whatever that math equation tells us. But it's really good for insurance companies though, because insurance companies charge higher premiums for people with a high BMI, which includes healthy and unhealthy folks. So they just bring in money no matter what if you're over an arbitrary height or weight ratio. And the other thing is that like BMI is arbitrary, that the CDC has changed its ideal weight before, and millions of people were suddenly overweight or obese overnight who previously were not in those categories. And so we know that BMI can't tell us anything except an arbitrary answer to a math problem. Like it really doesn't account for health, lifestyle, habits, any of that stuff. And the reason that I kind of like just want to talk about that is because I think it's important to look at the context that this whole measuring tool was created with, right? Which was to find who's the ideal human and who are the deformed monsters. That's like a quote. That's not me being hyperbolic.
Right.
So I think the context and the intention with which a research tool that's basically used throughout the world to categorize humans is really important. Yeah. And also the fact that it's kind of junk science, right? Like we can talk about public health and we can look at trends and things like that, and that's important, but I think that this conversation is worth having, that like in our mainstream culture, health is something that we always consider as like quantifiable or measurable, right? It's like a one size fits all way of like categorizing people. And that's not exactly how health works, right? We have, I think a narrative in our culture that if you want to get healthier, you just need to like eat better and you need to exercise and then you will be healthy, right? But inputs matter, they do, but they only matter so much. And we don't talk a lot about, in America particularly, like the social determinants of health, right? So there's a whole list of these, right? It's about a dozen or more, but they include things like income and education and early childhood development, housing,
social relationships,
right? All of that, gender, race, disability, like all of that
code.
Stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, and those are very real factors and inputs that do make a huge difference to folks' health.
Well, and in arthritis in particular, so we've done research in underserved minorities with arthritis who have arthritis at similar rates, and yet their experience of the arthritis is very different, partly because of social determinants, partly because of access to healthcare, treatment, bias within the healthcare system, et cetera. And so whether or not those social determinants actually lead to the disease itself, they do affect the impact of the disease on quality of life, treatment options, symptoms, et cetera.
Yeah. And I think like it's just important to remember, about social determinants of health, especially when we have a conversation like this, where it's like, okay, you're an individual, you have a problem, right? Arthritis, if that's a problem for you. And a lot of people, I know some people that live with arthritis, it doesn't cause them a problem. They comes up on the scans, they don't have pain. Pain science is a whole nother thing that we can get into. And but I think like when we're looking at an individual and saying like, okay, this is a problem for you, you've got a joint replacement in your future, here are the treatment options available.
Right.
When that person is thin, we tend to see a range of treatment options for them that are presented. And when that person is fat, we tend to see weight loss, like as the first intervention that's presented to them. And so in this culture, I think we're really invested in prescribing like individual solutions to systemic problems because it's in the dominant culture's interest to do so, right? Like this is sort of the American ideal of like anyone can get rich or lose weight or protect themselves from violence if they only try hard enough. And the real deal is that it takes political policy, not a diet or exercise plan or weight loss plan to affect social determinants of health, right?
Right, on a broader scale.
And like, and I just want to complete this thought. Like, I think if we're talking about a population-wide health problem, right? That's how obesity is treated, as a population problem. It's an epidemic. If we're talking about a population-wide problem and we aren't addressing the social determinants of health, we're missing the point and ignoring the population.
Yes.
And absolutely. as fat people, we can't separate our fat from our humanity.
Right.
So a war on obesity is a war on my right to exist as a person. And so when we fight for better healthcare, access to public space, or equal pay, or all those things that I talked about, the like systemic ways that fat folks are discriminated against, we are talking about health. Right. And so, science is like this cultural endeavor that seems really consumed with like figuring out how this adipose tissue, right, how this fat impacts my biology as a fat person, and also at the same time super uninterested in how social structures impact that same biology. So like when culture views fat people as a problem and not as people, that's when we start to run into trouble, right? Because that's when people start coming into, that's when I go into a doctor's office with strep throat, and the first thing the doctor wants to talk about is my weight. Like
right.
That, right. So I think that, we can't talk about fat folks' health without looking at that cultural context, because being fat means that you're navigating stigma and shame and discrimination and lower pay and unequal access to healthcare and all that stuff that I mentioned already. It's hard to thrive when you can't have equal access and opportunity, and all the time your body is being discussed as an epidemic. So talking about fat people's health without acknowledging those structures and systems that create and exacerbate health problems is pretty disingenuous, I think, especially when it's layered on top of this dominant culture that's super invested in me as a fat person hating myself, right? Because if I accept myself, then I don't need to buy diets, or I don't need to invest in weight loss programs, or I don't need to do whatever. And also, accepting myself doesn't mean that I never look at health or address that, because there are evidence-based ways of addressing health outcomes for folks of all sizes that don't include intentional weight loss. So I know I said a lot. I'll pause.
Yeah. Okay. So there are a few things that I want to respond to that you said. One is that, so as a public health researcher, I'm very interested in policy and how policy shapes access and people's ability to change their lifestyle should they choose to do that. It's very hard, for example, to eat healthy food when it takes you 2 hours to get to a grocery store and you're shopping at the midday or around the corner that only has canned food. Or it's difficult to stay active when you're in an unsafe neighborhood and you can't go outside and you don't have access to equipment, when you're working 3 jobs and taking care of kids and don't have leisure time to be able to do dedicated exercise, etc. And there are many, the societal situations that lead to our ability or lack of ability to make certain choices for ourselves and our families are very real. And when an individual is living with arthritis and they're looking for what their options are, saying, well, we need to change public policy around, recess at public schools and the, free lunch program is not satisfying. So I want to acknowledge that we need policy change, and that policy change has a role in all of these issues that you're talking about.
Yep.
And that individuals also are looking for real solutions to the challenges that they're facing. So one thing that you brought up is that there are lots of ways to get healthier that don't have anything to do with intentional weight loss. And so for people living with arthritis, for example, one of those is to strengthen the muscles that surround the joint. You were talking about load on the joint. And that just looking at an equation that equates body weight to load on the joint doesn't take into consideration the actual structure of that joint for a particular individual and what the tissues are, how they're arranged, etc. And one thing we know is that when quadriceps are stronger, knee replacement is delayed. Again, this is looking at data. This is not looking at an individual person, but from a data perspective, there's an association between stronger quadricep muscles and delayed knee replacement. And that's because the quadriceps muscle group crosses over the knee joint, and the more stable the knee joint is, the less friction there is, and therefore the less degradation of the connective tissue. And so having a strong quadriceps group can slow the progression of knee arthritis and therefore delay knee replacement. In terms of diet, eating a diet that is low in inflammatory foods can affect swelling, can affect pain, and a variety of other things that happen internally. That being said, there is also an association between weight loss and reduced knee pain. And you said something about pain science that one thing that you mentioned that I think is really important is that there is actually very little relationship between the the advancement of the arthritis itself and the level of pain. So you mentioned that there are people who have arthritis but don't have any pain. There are also people who have a lot of pain but very limited arthritis.
Tissue pathology. Yeah.
Yeah. And one of the reasons for that is that in the context of chronic pain, the brain is involved. And there are all kinds of things that happen in the brain that are not happening in the knee that influence the experience that we have of pain. And there are also all kinds of tools that we use in yoga that can change the descending pain pathways, the way that information goes from the brain to the knee to tell us what to do with the information that we're getting there. And that those tools include breathing practices that turn off the stress response, and mindfulness that helps us to distance ourselves from an experience and be aware of it and see it neutrally, practices that help us to reframe. So Pratipakshabhavana, that takes a negative perspectives and turns it to a positive one. So all of these have nothing to do with what's happening in my knees, but have a lot to do with the pain that I'm going to experience. That being said, there does appear to be a relationship between weight loss and knee pain, and perhaps that is largely psychological. Pain is entirely subjective, and so we don't know when somebody is reporting that their pain has changed, why specifically their pain has changed. But
yeah, and I'm like super interested in that part of the conversation too. So like, but I don't want to cut you off.
Well, okay, so what I want to pose to you is, if there is a relationship between weight loss and knee pain, then how can we have that conversation in a way that is not shameful or blameful, that still allows the opportunity for somebody with a larger body to use all of their available tools, including, strengthening their thighs and working with their breath and changing their perspective, but also maybe intentionally losing weight, which could delay knee replacement. And if you choose between losing 5% of your body weight and having a knee replacement, I think lots of people would choose the former, not to suggest that's an easy thing to do or that it's even possible for everyone.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So there's a lot of like little.
I know I put a lot out there.
Here. That's okay. So I want to start by first saying I'm a yoga teacher. And this, just because I think a lot of yoga teachers are listening to this conversation, I'm sure this is something you talk about in your trainings, but we have a scope of practice as yoga teachers, you know what I mean? And so like none of us that are yoga teachers, full stop, right? You're a yoga therapist, you're a researcher, you may have a different scope of practice than I do. You definitely do. But those of us who have yoga certifications only, we're not prescribing weight loss to people.
We're not prescribing anything.
We're not prescribing anything. Yeah. So I just want to be like real clear.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Because I'm going to give my opinion about whether or not weight loss should be prescribed. But it's my opinion as a yoga teacher and as a fat activist and whatever.
So Amber, but what about not prescription from any professional, but what about speaking to the actual person living with arthritis?
Yeah. We're getting there. I just want to mention scope of practice because I think it's important in these conversations that we are going to get people coming to us with arthritis. We're going to have probably people in larger bodies with arthritis coming to us. As yoga teachers, we hear like, well, I'm trying to lose weight and I'm trying to get healthier and like I'm here to, so we are involved in this equation. But I think as yoga teachers, it's important to remember like what strategies we get to suggest and provide and supervise. I don't know if that's the right word, but like we get to be involved in one aspect of like treatment, even though we're not supposed to use that word, right? Like yoga, has tons of tools that are useful and effective for arthritis that we can offer. That doesn't include anything about nutrition or diet or any of that stuff. So I'm not,
Yeah, thank you.
I want to put that in the air.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we can remember what our scope of practice is.
Yeah.
So as, you brought me on to ask my opinion, so here it is. I read the same research. I think that we can look at the chart, right? We were talking about with ice cream and drownings or whatever. Right? There's a very compelling chart there. And we see that a loss of 5 to 10% of body weight did result in better outcomes for folks with arthritis, namely that they get to delay joint replacement a while. I think that's the specificity of this research. So I think yay for better outcomes. I think it's also worth like digging a little bit into the research and asking, like, do we know for sure that the weight loss was what helped with the outcome?
Right.
Or perhaps is it the stuff that resulted in accidental weight loss, such as lowering your, inflammation in your diet, the activity that was probably taken up, right? We've already talked about that, like strengthening muscles results in better outcomes. Maybe learning to move well, right? Like
body awareness.
These things, body awareness. We know that in pain science, proprioception, right, the sense of where our body is in space, a lot of which is informed from the amount of movement that we do. Proprioception decreases pain. So exercise itself is known to decrease pain. All of these things that when these people took on this weight loss project, we don't actually have those isolated factors that we can point to and say, like, it was definitely the weight loss, it wasn't this other thing. We do have this math equation around biomechanics and joints, but remember, we're looking at that from like a public health big data chart perspective and not an individual perspective. So I think it's just important to remember all that stuff. It's a lot harder in research, and you know this much better than I do, to have an A plus B equals C equation and not just a like, well, A and B are here and C happened, which is how most of the research sounds. It's not very like satisfying, right? So I think that's an important awareness to have. I think the other side of this is, what do we know about intentional weight loss and people's success with that? And this is a very well-studied phenomenon that 95% of the time, people that diet to lose weight or who pursue intentional weight loss, 95% of those efforts fail. And most of those people, 95 to 98%, are going to regain the weight that they lost over 1 to 5 years. Most of those regaining it within the 1 to 2 year mark. So,
and Amber, I just want to point out too that when it's regained, the composition tends to be different. So when people lose weight, they tend to lose a combination of muscle and fat. And when it gets regained, they tend to have less muscle than before they lost the weight.
Right. So weight loss, intentional weight loss, over the long term, we've seen actually cause people to be fatter than they were before, right? If we're looking at body composition and things like that. We also know that weight cycling, which is this lose, gain, gain cycle that many, many people are familiar with. If you've ever been on a diet, it's probably something you've experienced, is terrible for health and has like cardiovascular risks and effects on our metabolism and all those types of things. So
less healthy than remaining at a higher weight consistently.
Yeah, and that's what the evidence seems to point at, is that, like, they've done studies side by side of folks who pursued intentional weight loss and then folks who pursued a health at every size model of wellness, which I can go into more. But health at every size, basically, the tenets are that weight and health are two different things, and that our best chance at health, right, if we're looking at markers like blood sugar and quality of life and lipids and, all of the like A1C, all the measurable like
risk factors,
blood work and that kind of stuff, right? If we are looking at that as a measure of health, plus like a well-being sort of evaluation tool, right, that's given to these participants, the folks who did health at every size, which means they address things like diet, things like exercise, things like quality of life, access to community and meaning, access to pursuing their healthcare in a way that feels right to them and that prioritizes it to the degree that they want to, right? Always the cohort that didn't do the intentional weight loss side ended up with better outcomes. I'm sure you have a question, but I just want to
go ahead.
say, so I feel like, we have this information that Okay, people who reduced their body weight by 10% saw better outcomes. We've already discussed that that better outcome is a very complex thing, right? That has some stuff in pain science, has some stuff in, biomechanics, has some stuff in, I don't know, maybe the way that that person is now being treated by their medical staff, who's like, oh, you're doing all the right things, right? Like that affects outcomes.
Or all of their social contacts.
All their social contacts, right? So society is treating this person better. How would that affect the outcome of any disease, not just arthritis? Right? So we have all these factors, and we know that 95% of the time, this weight loss effort is going to fail. The person's going to end up fatter than they were. If that's what we're worried about, prescribing intentional weight loss is not ethical, evidence-based healthcare, my opinion. So I'll pause there.
Okay, yeah. So because you're talking about intentional weight loss when somebody sets out to lose weight as a goal.
Where weight loss is the goal, not
not a healthier lifestyle.
Correct. We're not like, we're going to get your A1C down. Let's talk about strategies for that, right? That's different than you need to lose 10% of your body.
So there is some evidence that when people begin a yoga practice, and we're talking about the kind of yoga that probably you and I are more inclined to teach, not hot vinyasa flow, but that a yoga practice is associated with weight loss, but the mechanism is not the burning of calories that happens during vigorous exercise. The mechanism is mindfulness. That when people learn to be mindful on the mat, that translates to being mindful off the mat, which means getting up to move when their body feels like it needs to move, not eating when they realize that their body isn't hungry. And I think that for a lot of people with arthritis, there is a lack of mindfulness when it comes to the body, because being aware of your body means being aware of your pain. And so shutting off that sensation or ignoring it in order to cope and get through the day can also mean not being mindful about lifestyle choices that could affect that pain. So that's like a really complicated set of relationships. Can you speak to that at all?
Sure. I mean, we can talk hypothetically about this, but we don't really know, right? Like, we don't know if that yoga intervention and mindfulness is what resulted in, like, we don't know if the increased mindfulness from a yoga intervention, which I think like probably most people who have a yoga intervention will increase their mindfulness. There's no way to measure that and know like, oh, this mindfulness increase.
There are ways to measure it, but they may be imperfect.
Right. And they are not as simple as the equation that I think researchers want to be able to present, which
like
is
using a mindfulness.
Mindfulness means these people ate like 3,000 less calories a week. Therefore, their weight loss resulted in this.
No, Amber, I think that in this particular research, it's a relationship between their level of mindfulness. So people doing yoga who exhibited more mindfulness also experienced more weight loss. Not that it was about calories in, calories out, but if you rated higher in mindfulness, you also, it's a correlation.
No, and I want us to be real clear that that's what they found, right? Yeah. Because you did mention like with increased mindfulness, you get up and move when you feel
you might, right. That's conjecture.
You pay attention to what you eat. And so I think I'm not trying to get down on you, but just to point out that like, even when we talk about fat folks, that assumption is there that like everyone is fat because they're eating more calories than they expend. And that's not the case.
Yes.
That's not that simple. Like if we knew that that was the case, then intentional weight loss would work 100% of the time.
Sure.
Right? Like if you, and we probably wouldn't have very many fat people because it's not super fun to be a fat person in this society. Right? Like if it was just that simple to go lose weight, we would have all done it. Because like no one is enjoying the way that fat folks are treated or approached in this society. Well, fat folks aren't enjoying it. I'll just say that. Like, so I think that I just want to, make sure that when we talk about mindfulness as a mechanism that resulted in weight loss, that we can say we saw increased mindfulness, we saw weight go down.
Right.
We can't really definitively say
Yes.
anything else about
That's
that.
a great point.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Like,
absolutely.
so, and the reason I'm not trying to be like, in every technicality, I'll get you on it. That's not the purpose of me like pointing this stuff out. It's just more like, we all have this underlying unconscious bias or conscious bias for some of us that, you know, fat folks are fat because they ate too much and they didn't exercise. Right? That fat is something that you choose to be and that you choose to maintain. And so I think, and we don't actually have data to back that up. Fat folks eat lots of food. Fat folks eat not very much food. Thin folks eat lots of food. Thin folks eat not very much food. There's no fat diseases that thin people also don't get. Right. And so we want these very simple, like, well, if you do this, this, and this, then you'll be at default body status, which is thin without disease. Mm-hmm. And that's just not how human bodies work. And so it's difficult, right, to, you know, I never want to be a public health researcher that has to release a statement because I feel like that's a really hard thing to do, right? Like what the Arthritis Foundation or Association or whatever that group is called, you know, they have to release a statement that says, if you have osteoarthritis, do this for increased, you know, whatever. And so it's really hard to get those definitive statements. I mean, it took like decades to make the actual link between smoking and lung cancer, much less something that's as multifaceted as health or body size, which we don't 100% understand all the causes. And we see that because everybody knows like their thin friend who eats crap all the time and drinks like a fish and smokes and is stressed out and, you know, they're thin. And we know everyone who has a fat friend who's you know, a vegetarian and exercises 5 days a week and does all the things and is still at a higher weight. So, yeah.
Thank you so much for that, Amber. I want to ask you one last thing, and I appreciate all the time that you've dedicated to this and your frankness, and you know, you clearly know a whole lot, not just about your subject matter, but about all the complexities around these issues. And as a researcher myself, I'm incredibly impressed with the nuance with which you can talk about the research. So let's say somebody is listening to this right now who is female, in her 60s, overweight, her knees hurt, she is trying to practice yoga because she's heard that it might help reduce her pain. She really just wants to be able to like get on the floor and play with her grandkids and be able to go for a walk in the park, and she's struggling and she wants to do whatever she can to change that situation for herself. What would you say to that person?
I mean, if this person's coming to me asking for advice, I'm going to say a few things. A, I'm not a doctor and I don't own an x-ray machine, so you got to go get that all sorted out with your medical team, right? I would give this person some advice on how to maybe advocate for themselves in a healthcare situation, because we know that fat folks who go into a doctor's office are going to be prescribed different treatments and seen or not seen and not taken seriously differently than people who go into a doctor's office in a thinner body. So I might suggest some things like, when you are talking with your medical team, you know, if weight loss is provided as the only solution, usually the next question I ask when I'm at a doctor's office is, okay, well, do thin people ever get this condition? And I know that's like a little bit of a facetious question, but I think it's an important one to ask. Because the answer is always, yes, they do. And the next question I ask is, what treatment options do you offer to thin patients who have this condition? Can we explore some of those? Like, are those effective for people at higher weights? And the answer is, I think, almost always yes, right? You've talked about a lot of those options. And if the, you know, I have my own opinion about intentional weight loss. I've stopped pursuing intentional weight loss. I've pursued health at every size. You know, my health has increased since I've done that, not decreased, even though my body weight has stayed the same, right? While I was dieting, body weight went up and down and up and down and up and down. And when I stopped, my body weight stabilized. And my health stabilized once I addressed things like my diet, eating foods that are supportive to my body and that make me feel good. Definitely mindfulness. Like yoga has been a huge catalyst in not only like, well-being in my body. Like my proprioception is better. My pain is decreased. I have all these tools that aren't asana-based, like breathing and meditation and self-study and all of those things to supplement like what the yoga is doing, right? So when the pain science that we were talking about is this biopsychosocial model of pain, right? Where the biology matters, your mind matters, the way that you
all the koshas
identify with pain, exactly, and the social determinants of health that we've talked about. So I think like if someone's coming to me, maybe as a friend or as a student that's asking like, what should I do? That's where I'm going to start is like, well, go get a medical evaluation, know how to advocate for yourself in a medical situation, see what that team puts together for you. If an individual chooses to pursue weight loss as part of that, I'm for body autonomy. So I think you can do that if you want to. I think plenty of people are going to get a short-term outcome that helps them. Yeah. I just don't personally know, and the researchers don't know, if that weight loss caused that better outcome or all these other things we're talking about, right? So
what you
I'm
did
not
to
saying
lose
like,
the weight. Right.
I'm not saying if this person in her 60s who's suffering chooses to pursue weight loss, like, well, she's dumb and she's bad and she doesn't understand the research. Nope. I completely like empathize with fat folks in this society that choose to pursue weight loss as a result of, or like to survive, like if all of your doctors and your family and your work and the media are all saying like, your body is wrong, your body is inherently unhealthy, I can't blame someone that that chooses to try to like change that. I personally think that prescribing intentional weight loss as a medical provider is not ethical, evidence-based healthcare. I think it looks toward this societal view of like the way for us to end stigma and shame and get better results for fat folks is to make them less fat. And like I don't really think that that's the approach. So as a yoga teacher, I'm going to tell her, go see your medical team. Here's some guidelines for how I would approach that. Just as a fat activist, I share like that, information, how to advocate for yourself in a medical situation. But then as a yoga teacher, I'm going to talk to you about how managing your mind has a lot to do with your pain and has a lot to do with your outcome, right? I think that sometimes the sort of like public health interventions tend to disempower folks rather than empower folks. And I'll just give an example. There's, some, I believe it's to do with disc degeneration and like, you shouldn't put your spine into flexion. Well, like, so these people are not supposed to like pick anything up off the floor. Like that's, it's not realistic. And it also isn't empowering, where we know that with arthritis, like loading the joints is going to help. Learning to move well is going to help. Learning to maybe reduce inflammation in your diet is going to help. Learning how to manage your mind, how to be present to your body's sensations, increasing your proprioception, turning down nociception, which we didn't get into, but like has to do with pain science in like, if you're keyed up and like you're, it's like a motion sensor. I think Greg Lehman came up with this analogy. If you have an alarm system in your house and you have a motion detector, you want the motion detector to pick up a person. You don't want it to pick up an ant, right? And so if your system is so keyed up that every little input says pain, 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 then we know that we can have better results with that through something like a yoga intervention where we learn to have more body awareness and decrease pain. So I think that, if I have a friend or a student who's asking me, intentional weight loss is not the first solution that I would show to this person. I will present the evidence as I understand it, that we've seen a 10% drop in body weight can delay a joint replacement, but we also don't have that weight loss as a completely isolated factor that helps with the outcome. Here's what we do know. All of these other interventions and treatments and, and tools in your toolbox will help you decrease pain, decrease inflammation, have a better outlook, have a better mindset. And all of that cumulatively, we hope, is going to start helping folks to get to a place where they can basically live the life they want to live, right? That's the only reason that this is a problem. Like, we want folks to be able to get up and down off the floor and play with their kids and all that stuff. And so if we can, I think that, for the folks listening to this conversation, I think folks should be given all of the information and tools that are available. And we just know that when fat folks go into a medical office, they tend to not get that list. Yeah. They tend to get one intervention, which is, what are you going to do about your weight? Yeah. And so, until policy changes, until, cultural notions of, body size being a diagnosis change, I think that at the individual level as fat folks, like, we have to be able to advocate for ourselves a little bit, or maybe have a friend who is willing to advocate. Fat folks have a lot of trauma around, not all, but many have trauma around, the bias and the discrimination that they've received in medical situations. And so sometimes that just might mean, getting a friend on your side who understands the research and who's not having that fraught relationship with a doctor or whatever, to be the one to talk to them about this. I also want to point out Reagan Chastain. She is a fat activist and a speaker and writer and all this, and she does a lot of really great blog posts and roundups and articles about how fat folks can advocate better for themselves in medical situations. And on her website, there's, which is danceswithfat.com, she has a series of posts about for fat patients and their doctors, including like little cards you can print out that have actual research on there, that have questions to ask, things like that. So even if having that conversation is hard, you can even hand the card to your doctor. You know what I mean? And so
that's great.
Yeah, so that might be a good tool to, we can link to it if you're, if this is
excellent.
And I think just overall, since we have like yoga teachers and folks like that listening to this, we can all do some work around uncovering our conscious and unconscious biases. Yeah. And when a student comes into your classroom, do you see a student or do you see a fat student?
Right.
And, and how it, not that, you should,
and that crosses all aspects of identity. Do you see a disabled person? Do you see an older person? Do you
and the goal is not to be like, I don't see color, I don't see body size, I just like see humans. Like, no, that's not what we're talking about. But when you address that person as a yoga teacher, a yoga therapist, a physio, like whatever you are, whatever your role is, are you operating from that dominant cultural narrative of, I see a fat body, therefore I see a disorder or a disease or pathology or something to be fixed, versus when we see a thin body and we just assume this person's thin, so they must be healthy. And even if that's not the sentence that goes through your mind, I think a lot of us have tons of unconscious bias that we can recognize when it comes up. We can start to see it. We can start to look at the assumptions that we place on bodies, whether that's that they're unhealthy or that their unhealthiness is their fault, or, this can go far into like how the cultural narrative talks about ability and disability, right? Like all of this conversation we're having now, like think about how this traces back to Quetelet, the guy that invented the BMI chart, and what he was trying to find, right? Like research has bias in it. This guy was trying to find the ideal man who, was the moral.
So
he was trying to find the moral.
Researchers are not trying to prove anything. They're trying to uncover patterns and make sense of those patterns. But we're all human and we all have biases, and researchers are not immune to that as much as they may try to reduce their bias or the influence of their bias. I'm a yoga researcher, and I try to not want yoga to win, or not even think about it that way.
Yeah, but you do. And just like if I started doing research on people in higher weight bodies, I would want the results to show like, people who have humanity, we're just like them people. We just happen to be in this spot, so it will show up in the research. And I just think that that's really important for us to remember, not only when we're reading research and trying to understand it and trying to understand how something that's designed to look at large groups of people applies to one person, which is like a very complicated thing, but also, as individuals who are teaching students or who may have students come to us with these types of questions, like before we speak, are we addressing that person from a place of, hey, I'm recognizing your humanity and here's all the tools that I know about, versus, well, you're fat, so weight loss obviously is the first place to go. And that's kind of,
I want to advocate for research literacy here, just because the reason we were able to have this conversation at such a high level is because you are incredibly research literate, and you don't read something in the media and take it for granted that it's accurately reflecting the research. It requires a skill set that I think most people have not been taught, which is to be able to go to the methodology and look for the bias and look for what does the science actually say versus what is the spin around it so that it gets more clicks.
Yeah, or even just, and I'm fairly new to this. I mean, I've been reading research about, obesity and overweight and fat studies and all that stuff, just as like sort of a tangential to like the activism that I do, but also, I'm in my 300-hour teacher training program right now with Jules Mitchell, who's also another yoga researcher. And so like I have learned how to determine the difference between like high quality research and something that's not as high quality, or what the different types of studies are, or even when you read an abstract of a study, which is what's available on like PubMed or Google Scholar, you're seeing a very condensed amount of information that might not actually tell you, there may be conclusive sentences in that abstract that when you dig a little further and look at like, oh, well, where did that come from? Oh, that came from this study. I mentioned that like, well, we don't know that equation. Did it come from a cadaver bone, right? Like we were just reading about disc degeneration, that kind of thing. And one of the studies they based it on was like, well, discs can handle this amount of strain before they fail. But the study that they based that on was about like cadavers being dropped on their heads. But this was a yoga headstand research study. So like, that's a very different thing, right?
Right, absolutely.
So yes, I mean, I don't want to get too much off on a tangent, but I just think that like, it is, when we're looking at a population health problem, quote unquote, like, overweight or obesity or, any osteoarthritis for that matter, we need to remember that we're not only looking at like probably large numbers of data that's then averaged, onto a chart, but that information, like how that impacts an individual or how that should be used in application onto an individual, I think are really unanswered questions, because we don't have a healthcare system in this country that views folks as individuals. You know what I mean? Like, can you imagine if you went to the doctor and instead of like, I don't know, as far as like I'm concerned, like when I go into the doctor, a lot of times, like the first thing they want to talk about is my weight. They don't even look at my chart. Could you imagine like if the doctor sat down and like had a conversation with me and was like, so, you're coming to me with this concern. You have knee pain. Okay, we're going to do these tests. Now we're going to put together like a really individualized treatment plan that takes into consideration your lifestyle and your goals, and how you might be able to comply with this stuff, and how we can put social support around you to make sure that that's easy, and really address some of these social inequalities that you have to make sure that you're set up for success. Like that would look like a completely different outcome than your weight is your fault and we need to address that before we can even treat you as a patient. And which I think is the experience that a lot of fat folks have.
Something that I say often is that you are the world's leading expert of your own body. Yes. And so being able to know, whatever that data says, and as a public health researcher, I do have to say that public health has been responsible for incredible strides in improving our health and quality of life. So not to dismiss that, but that data doesn't necessarily generalize to a specific person. That data is not going to tell you more about your own body than you can, or that you and your doctor can figure out together. So being able to advocate for what you know about your own body and your own experience is so important.
For sure.
Amber, thank you so much. This has been an incredible conversation. I'm grateful to know you and to have had the opportunity to talk to you about this.
Hey, thanks for chatting with me about it. And I'm really excited to get to talk to you, even though I'm a little nervous, like talking about research with a researcher, because I'm definitely not. But it's, I just appreciate the fact that you and within your organization and whoever this reaches, I think uncovering unconscious bias and even asking these really difficult questions of how can we be sensitive to folks, not because we don't want to ever hurt a fat person's feelings by telling them they're fat. Trust me, they know. And they've probably been told to lose weight before, directly or indirectly. So it's not even about that. It's more about how do we honor the humanity of the folks that are coming to us for help, and not just help with their physical bodies, but for spiritual guidance and for mental health reasons and all of that stuff. And so it's really encouraging to me to, just that you want to have this conversation and that you want, this approach to, better outcomes for folks who are living with arthritis or who are, facing a surgery or a disability, permanent disability status sort of thing that is really difficult to deal with, that we are looking at the whole person and not just seeing body size as pathology. And so I think it's super important, and I just really appreciate you creating an opportunity for us to talk about it.
Thank you so much, Amber. And you're my neighbor. We're talking on Zoom, but you're in the next neighborhood over. So maybe next time we can chat in person.
Yes, we have to get our hermetically sealed recording studio set up. Otherwise, we have to meet at my office, which is a coffee shop. So, but yeah, it's cool to be here in Baltimore, and I'd love to get together sometime. And
great. Thank you so much.
All right.